Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Thea Lee. I am president of the Economic Policy Institute, and I am delighted to welcome all of you to today's webinar on confronting employer power to address race and gender discrimination and disparities. This event is part of a 3-year interdisciplinary project at EPI, spearheaded by senior economist and former president Larry Michel. The project, Unequal Power, was inspired by Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It includes work from several interlocking disciplines, including legal studies, political science, sociology, philosophy, labor history, and of course, economics. Our focus is on the inherent asymmetry of power in the foundational labor market relationship between workers and employers. Contrary to what we sometimes call Econ 101 thinking, workers and employers do not meet in the labor market as equals. Imbalances of information, wealth, and institutional frameworks contribute to lopsided bargaining power for employers. We would like to thank the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, the Bernard and Ann Spitzer Charitable Trust, and the Nick and Leslie Hanauer Foundation for their generous support of this work. I invite all of you to check out the website for the project, where we are posting the papers as they're done. It is epi.org/unequalpower. Today's focus is on how generations of systemic racism and sexism contribute to this imbalance of power. We have 4 terrific speakers today. Nancy Fulbray, Professor Emerita at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, a leading feminist economist. Jenny Yang, former chair of the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and now in the Biden administration as director of the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs. Jane Liu, former legal director of the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, and Valerie Wilson, director of the Economic Policy Institute's program on race, ethnicity, and the economy. We are very fortunate to have Gina Smilik, economics reporter of the New York Times, as the moderator of today's event. Gina, over to you.
Great, thank you so much. So I guess we will jump right into it here because we have a limited amount of time. And Nancy Fulbray, we're hoping to start with you today. In your paper, you write that outright discrimination represents only the tip of a larger iceberg that has frozen women into economic disadvantage. And you emphasize that there's really this bigger social and historical picture in which institutions are shaped by unequal bargaining power based on things like class, race, and gender. I wonder if you could walk us through some of the ways in which different dimensions of unequal bargaining power have contributed to really persistent gender pay gaps.
Well, mainstream economics puts a lot of emphasis on preferences, including preferences for discrimination. And I think preferences matter, but preferences really aren't the whole story. I think there's something that we could call strategic discrimination, which are circumstances where employers are just paying certain groups of workers less because they know they can. And why can they? Often their ability to do so is the result of a historical pattern of discrimination in previous years that carries over. There's a way in which inequality is really reproduced through a lot of different mechanisms, both at the work site and in society as a whole. So some of these are the information asymmetries that Jane Liu and Jenny Yang are going to be talking about later. I'll just mention a couple of them here. About half of all workers in the US are subject to pay secrecy rules, so they can't really find out what other workers are earning. So how can they know if they're being discriminated against or not? Another really good example are salary history questions, where employers ask, what did you earn in your last job? Well, of course, a potential employee can refuse to answer the question, but if they do, they probably won't get the job. And when they do, the employer has a cue that allows them to pay less. And there's really good empirical research showing that in states where pay secrecy, where pay secrecy has been outlawed, but also where salary history questions have been prohibited, we see a big improvement in the relative earnings of women and also workers of color. So I think that's pretty significant. But there's also the supply side of inequality. And there, I think mainstream economics sort of emphasizes luxury preferences, like, oh, women would just prefer to stay home with their kids, and that's why they earn less. Or some people are just lazy and don't really want to work, and that's why we're seeing a different labor supply pattern there. But there are a lot of factors on the supply side that are not at all related to preferences, that they're related to public policy, like lack of access to education, lack of access to a social safety net, childcare, family leave. And there's a lot of empirical evidence that the lack of really good social policy in the US has really lowered women's participation in employment. And we've seen that really amplified by the pandemic.
Right, that is a really interesting point. And I guess I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how what you just said matters in the context of the way we traditionally study things like the gender pay gap, because it seems like some of the things you just talked about, the difference between preferences and realities might be relevant here.
Well, economists are very fond of estimating human capital equations with a ton of variables: education, experience, occupation, industry, unionization, place, so forth and so on. But the most egregious problem, I think, with those specifications are that it doesn't really make sense to control for women's occupation or their industry, because a very large percentage of gender inequality comes from the fact that women and men are in different occupations and in very different industries. So if you control for that, and hold all else equal, you're really underestimating the gender pay gap. And what's really significant, I think, is that women are overrepresented in jobs that involve care for other people, health, education, social services. And there's a substantial amount of empirical evidence showing that earnings in those industries and occupations are lower than they are for workers with comparable personal characteristics in other occupations and industries.
How do you think it would change the discussion if we weren't controlling out those variables?
Well, I think we'd have to pay more attention to what the specific characteristics of the labor process and care work, and also in essential work, are that put workers at a disadvantage. I think that, again, the pandemic has been really instructive, where we've seen a lot of essential workers going to work, being at much higher risk and not being compensated for that higher risk in any significant way by bonus pay or hazard pay. And I think care workers, in particular healthcare workers, are really good instances of that. And you can also see other ways in which care work lowers workers' bargaining power. It's work that doesn't really produce a material thing. What it's producing is human capabilities: health, education, ability to function as a worker, ability to function as a citizen, ability to develop and maintain mental and physical health. And the social benefits of that kind of work are greater than the private benefits. And again, preferences come into the story, because mainstream economics is so focused on adult decisions about what people want or don't want and what they choose to get or not to get. But a lot of dependents, children, elderly, people who are sick, people who are facing a threat of illness or disability, they're not acting on preferences, they're acting on needs. And in these industries, we're trying to meet people's needs, not to satisfy their preferences. And I think that's another reason why market forces are not very helpful, because a lot of people who need things don't have the money to express the demand for them in the market. And then finally, I think care workers, almost by definition, have some kind of emotional or moral commitment to the work they do. And I think the best way to illustrate that is to think about nurses during the pandemic. I mean, yes, nurses engaged in some job actions like protesting outside of hospitals, but imagine what the work stoppages and strikes would have been if those nurses weren't motivated by something much, much bigger than concern for their own pay and working conditions. they engaged in a massive personal sacrifice to meet their obligations to their occupation. And I think that's very, that's very symbolic of the larger dilemma that a lot of care workers find themselves in.
That's such an interesting point, and I'm glad you brought it up because it seems like it kind of ties neatly back to the topic of today's event, which is really employer power. Because it seems like there's sort of this unfortunate consequence of people being so dedicated to their profession that they might give their bosses a lot of control over what they're actually doing. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of the intersection between some of the things you just talked about and how much power employers have over their employees.
Well, I think I'd like to think that part of that power resides from a kind of the way that we understand or interpret the employer-employee relationship. And I think calling attention to bargaining power and emphasizing the way in which wages and working conditions are the outcome of a bargaining process is something that actually could help a lot, instead of kind of accepting the conventional explanation that people just get what they deserve and deserve what they get, and that's how markets work, and that's what's so great about them. But I think it also really requires, as part of that bargaining process, thinking about collective action and thinking about developing the coalitions and alliances that are needed to really change the balance of power. Some of those coalitions and alliances take place in the workplace, where workers are trying to unionize or to bargain or to maneuver or to persuade employers to speak more effectively to those needs. But some of that bargaining also takes place in the polity, in the community, where we're talking about what kind of public services we need and what kind of public rules we want to enforce.
Right. Right. That's interesting. And then I guess obviously when we talk about things like the pay gap and the lack of power for caregivers, this very much ends up being a conversation about sort of the gender pay gap many times, just given the composition of that workforce. I guess, just reflecting on the fact that it's been almost 60 years since the Equal Pay Act became law. We've obviously made a lot of progress since then, but we haven't completely ameliorated that distance. What needs to happen to your earlier point? What needs to happen to sort of get the final mile there?
Well, that's a really great question, and nobody really knows what that final mile is going to look like. But for what it's worth, I would say that we really need to challenge employer discrimination, and we need more effective tools to do that. And I think the later discussion is going to go into that point in more detail. I guess I would emphasize that we also need more public policies on the supply side that provide more public services and also more support for unpaid care. And I think the increase in childcare funding and the increase in the child tax benefit that's just been passed is a really, really good start in this direction. And I expect it to have significant labor market consequences. I think the division, we're accustomed to making this division between social policy and labor policy. And I guess I'm trying to argue from a feminist perspective, those two are very closely, they really need to hook up and hold on together.
I wonder if you could unpack a little bit what you just said for us. So when you say you think these are going to make a positive difference and a good start, how specifically do you see them sort of playing into the broader picture of the things we've just been talking about?
Well, look at the partisan debate over the increase in the child benefit. Republicans have been arguing that's going to create a disincentive to work, and it's going to have a bad influence on kind of the work ethic. But I view it in a very different way. It's going to give mothers, and single mothers in particular, the potential to pay for childcare so that they can go out and get better jobs. It's going to improve their fallback position in the labor market. And I think any policy that's kind of increasing the fallback position of workers, women workers and parents in particular, is something that's strengthening their kind of social bargaining power. It doesn't affect necessarily one individual employer. It's not, it's not a union negotiation, but it still has an impact on collective bargaining power in a really significant way.
Right. That's such an interesting point, and actually a really good transition point. Our next panelist is Valerie Wilson, and I think as we've been discussing, it does seem very clear that there are some real sort of differences in power that impact women in the labor market in particular. Valerie, I was hoping that you might be able to sort of how race sort of play this station. How does race factor into the balance of power between employees, and then specifically, how does that affect Black workers?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Gina. I'm going to start by stating the obvious. There is a long history and an ongoing legacy of racism in this country, and in particular, anti-Black racism that permeates every aspect of life in this country. The concept of race was constructed for the purpose of gaining privilege, access, power, and wealth. And within that construct, the identification of race is primarily based arbitrary. It's a physical characteristic, something that's totally outside of the control of an individual. So should, in theory, have no impact on their productive capacity in the workforce. Yet race is a part of the scaffolding, along with gender, that supports our nation's social and economic hierarchies. And in that hierarchy, Blackness is assumed inferior to whiteness. So within the labor market, the way that this shows up is in discriminatory patterns in hiring, in promotions, in pay, and it results in a general devaluation of Black labor that we observe through the large and persistent disparities in unemployment and pay between Black and white workers. Again, this affects everything from one's likelihood of getting a job, the kind of job that you get, the pay and benefits and working conditions that are available on that job. And we argue, my co-author, William Gary Jr. and I argue in our paper that these patterns have become so entrenched in our labor market that they've really become defining features of the youth labor market. I think everyone is familiar with the 2-to-1 disparity in unemployment, incredibly persistent over time, across education, by gender. Any way that we can slice that data, that disparity of how such persistent and long-lasting widespread disparities uniquely affect bargaining power for Black workers. The starting point of EPI's Unequal Bargaining Power project is that employers and employees don't approach the negotiation table with equal power. One of the things that gives employees or potential employees power is the existence of equally or more attractive employment options. Tight labor markets are really important in helping to boost that bargaining power of workers, but we know that over the last 4 decades, tight labor markets have more often been the exception as opposed to the norm. The fact that there's a 2-to-1 Black-white unemployment rate disparity means that at any level of unemployment, whether we're in a recession or a period of economic boom, we find that Black job seekers are typically about half as likely to secure employment as white job seekers. So their bargaining power is even further eroded because of that racial disparity. And that imbalance of power between the employee and the employer can affect anything from their willingness to challenge or question unfair and unsafe working conditions due to concerns about retaliation, concerns over how long it will take to find another job if they leave or lose that one, as well as the racial disparities that are present in things like income and wealth that make the consequences of job leaving or job loss even greater for Black workers. So it's just the complete surrounding of race in every aspect of life and the role that plays in how people sort of determine what position they're in to be able to bargain for a better position on the job affects those things differently for Black workers than for white workers in particular.
And I wonder if you could actually talk a little bit more about that, because I feel like this is a conversation you and I have been having for about 5 or 10 years now. Just this idea that I think a lot of times when we come, I cover macroeconomics as a day job, and a lot of times when we come at this question from a macroeconomic perspective, it seems like policymakers are very want to say the best thing we can do to lift up Black workers is just foster really strong economic conditions, a solid labor market that pulls folks in, like allows them to start building some sort of base. And you often push back on that when I try and write stories that say that. And I wonder if you could just walk through why for the audience.
Sure. So I think that those things are important. I look at having a really vibrant labor market, tight labor markets, as a foundation for addressing these disparities because of that issue related to trade-offs and alternatives that are available. When the unemployment rate is lower, again, although we typically still see a 2-to-1 ratio between the two, the absolute difference between Black and white unemployment is smaller, and the level of unemployment is in fact lower. But there's still a difference there. So there's a lot more that has to be done if the goal is to completely eliminate the gap. And I think where that takes us is thinking about what are some of the additional barriers that are faced, whether they be structural barriers. I talked about the role of race and that it's structured to create unequal outcomes. And so that's exactly what happens. And so unless we work to sort of dismantle those sorts of structures, we're going to continue to see these unequal outcomes. But I think there's also a role for lawmakers to play, because they do have the power to be more targeted and specific in their policy so that they can directly address what the specific barriers and issues are in different communities.
Right. That makes sense. And, obviously the framework we're using to understand these issues really matters, I think, as is evident. Can you talk us through, in your paper, you talk about stratification economics as sort of a way to understand some of these imbalances. And I'm wondering if you can walk us through what that means and how it differs from sort of a conventional view on economics.
Sure. So I'll do my best. My co-author, William Darity Jr., is one of several Black and Latino economists who pioneered this field of stratification economics. And it was developed largely in response to the fact that conventional economic theory has been inadequate to fully explain the intergroup inequality in general, and more specifically, the persistence of racial disparities in the labor market and throughout our society. Stratification economics emphasizes the role of group formation, group identity, and group action on an individual's life outcomes, as opposed to more conventional economic frameworks where individuals sort of act solely as autonomous optimizers, so without regard to where they stand in relation to someone else. It's an interdisciplinary approach, so it pulls in aspects of economics, sociology, and social psychology, and explicitly proposes that one's relative position does in fact matter, and that relative position both within your group, the group that you identify with, whether it be by race or gender or some other characteristic, as well as intergroup comparisons and relative status. And in fact, the key feature of this intergroup comparison is the identification of an outsider group, either defined by race, gender, class, religion, or again, any other category where we can think that people strongly identify. Under this framework, while discrimination is unjust, it may also be rational and functional, given the value that members from a dominant group place on their relative position with respect to the outsider group. So specifically, if white workers place some value on earning more than Black workers, or being in better positions than Black workers, then discrimination, is an outcome that is functional and rational. This framework also allows for the persistence of discrimination over time, as opposed to some of the models of discrimination, like taste-based discrimination or statistical discrimination, where it's assumed that competitive markets will compete away any discriminatory outcomes over time, so that in the long run, discrimination goes away. We know in reality that doesn't happen. So there's something else going on there. And then the stratification of workers with respect to their relative position is also something that can be exploited to shift the balance of power in favor of employers. For example, you can pay all employees less as long as you position one in a better position than the other. You can get away with paying less or underpaying all employees in theory.
Great. It's such an interesting way of thinking about the world. And I guess it's also a way that's sufficiently different from, I think, many of the frameworks we've been using, that it seems like we probably don't have as much data on how these sort of various group interactions work. Like, where are we on sort of mapping this universe?
So the way I think of it, I think we have very compelling empirical evidence and a solid historical record that points to discrimination as a significant factor in the persistence of racial disparities in the labor market. I think that the problem that we face has more to do with our interpretation of those disparities. For example, in labor economics, when we run a wage regression, we will typically include standard measures of what we consider indicators of individual productive capacity, such as education and experience. We may plug in some macroeconomic conditions, usually using state or region fixed effects to control for differences in cost of living or differences in local economic conditions. And then we plug in a race variable or a gender variable. And we'll often get a statistically significant coefficient on that race variable, even with all of these other things plugged into the equation that reasonably, should have some effect on pay, for example, but race, not so much so, given that we control for these other things. And what does that mean? Do we interpret that as evidence of racial discrimination? Or does it reflect some unobserved or omitted variable? Mainstream economics tends to dismiss discrimination as a valid or significant explanation of that gap in favor of the latter, that there's some unobserved or omitted variable. But if in fact there is some unobserved variable that would explain that statistically significant coefficient on race, it too would have to be strongly correlated with race. And then how do we interpret that correlation? Why would that variable be so strongly correlated with racial identity, which we've already established is an arbitrary, superficial characteristic? I think getting an answer to that question requires that we go beyond our standard individual-centered models and consider some of the structural and institutional factors, as well as what we can learn from social, psychological, and historical analyses to sort of get to what's behind that disparity. I think that's what the pioneers of stratification economics are attempting to do, to sort of bridge that gap. But in the absence of taking that broader sort of approach, we're left to lean on human capital theory and models of discrimination that have been inadequate in explaining those well-documented and persistent patterns of inequality. And that has led to an overemphasis on the shortcomings of the individual. So if there's a disparity, we must need more education, we must need to provide more skills and training, as opposed to there being some emphasis or more emphasis, any emphasis on what it will take to fix those biased or discriminatory systems that also play a role in creating those unequal outcomes.
Right. That's an interesting point. I guess, as we move toward a better understanding of these issues and, assuming we do, it sounds like we are headed in the right direction. How is that going to affect how we address these issues?
So I think of it in sort of three ways. I think first we have to think about our framing and how we talk about racial inequality in the labor market. And And it's important to recognize there are at least two complementary goals here. And more specifically, when we look at something like wages, we want to shift the balance of power in a way that raises wages overall at the same time that it closes those gender and racial pay gaps. And so what's necessary for that? We've talked a bit already about what I see as sort of the foundation. We need complementary monetary and fiscal policies that maximize employment. The Fed's monetary policy, historically, at least over the last 4 decades, has been too contractionary. And we've seen through the data that has limited wage growth for the bottom 80% of the workforce, as well as contributed to having an adverse effect on closing Black-white wage gaps. It's encouraging to see more of an acknowledgement of that role by the Fed. And I hope that moving forward, there is more willingness to avoid the sort of premature contractionary policies that cut short periods of economic expansion. And similarly, I think Congress has to avoid excessive or unnecessary austerity and use the tools that they have to create jobs and to really target those jobs in communities that have chronically high rates of unemployment. The second piece of that has to do with labor unions and the importance of giving workers a stronger collective voice to advocate for higher pay, better benefits, training and promotional opportunities, as well as protections against things like discrimination and harassment. Labor contracts help to create greater transparency and consistency through clearly defined policies and pay structures. And Black workers in particular, historically, have benefited from that and have recognized the value in that group has typically had the highest rates of union membership. Passage of the PRO Act in the House this week, I think, is great news. It's an important step towards strengthening our labor laws and meeting those objectives. And then finally, again, as we get ready to transition to the next paper, we want greater transparency in hiring, promotion, and pay decisions, and really consistent, robust enforcement of anti-discrimination law. We've had laws on the books for decades, but enforcement of those laws often has been less consistent and has sort of fluctuated depending on who's in office largely. But I think Jenny and Jane's research is important to understanding how power and the information imbalance hinder achieving that goal.
You set me up perfectly. So moving on to Jenny and Jane's paper. Jenny, I was wondering if you could kind of walk us through your paper. Your paper digs into why it's difficult to hold employers accountable for their discriminatory practices. And you talk about that along a couple of different lines. I was wondering if you could just kind of dig in or explain what kind of discrimination you digged into.
Sure. Thanks so much for having us here. And Valerie and Nancy, it's terrific to be able to engage with economists and think about how those concepts really intersect with anti-discrimination, because so much of what you said really rings true to me. And I think we have an opportunity to align incentives. So to Nancy's point that there's strategic discrimination, and to Valerie's point that it can be rational to discriminate. That is all true. And it's because our incentives have not sufficiently aligned our objectives with promoting anti-discrimination and the realities on the ground. So what we examine in our paper is how the power imbalance between employers and workers really undermines anti-discrimination enforcement. We specifically looked at race and gender, as well as national origin-based discrimination, but many of the same challenges impact the ability of workers to raise issues of discrimination based on disability, based on religion, based on age, and other protected bases. Because inherently the problem is that employers have a vast amount of power, right? Both in resources, both in information, and the ability to really prevent someone from ever being employed in an industry again. Yet the system that we've set up to enforce our anti-discrimination laws primarily requires workers to come forward and publicly accuse their employer of discrimination. So first, the worker has to have enough knowledge to know that they may have experienced discrimination. And that is often very hard, particularly in issues like hiring discrimination, where workers don't know who was hired or why they may not have been selected. Pay discrimination, where there's a culture of secrecy around pay, as Nancy pointed out, and workers don't know what other people are paid, right? So we expect workers to somehow find out the information they need to prove their case, to raise that complaint with their employer, even though we know that what happens when you raise a complaint is that you are likely to be retaliated against. Like over 60% of workers are often terminated. And the evidence actually suggests using the complaint process is usually not in an individual worker's best interest long-term. And we expect people to use this system, then to come forward either to an enforcement agency like the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, where I was the chair, and we have state and local affiliates around the country, right, that also can investigate charges. But you have to file a charge. That information is shared with the employer, right? And there are not enough resources at agencies like the EOC or at the state or local level to actually investigate fully and talk to all the witnesses. The agency is required to investigate every charge, but does not have the kinds of resources most workers would really like to see invested in their case to understand if they were discriminated against. The agency that I am now director of, the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs at the Department of Labor, I am appearing in my personal capacity, just want to make that clear, but I can talk a little bit about our work because the agency has very unique authority over federal contractors, and that is by contract. Entities that do business with the federal government agree to engage in non-discrimination, to promote equal opportunity, and really to engage in affirmative action to ensure that they do not have barriers to opportunity within their workplace. So the OFCCP has some unique jurisdictions to actually be much more proactive, to not rely, we take complaints, but that's not the primary work we do. We do regular compliance evaluations where we can collect data from employers and understand where barriers exist. And that's where I think we really need to move if we're going to address some of the systemic forms of discrimination that exist. And I will just say, most people think of discrimination as like a bad actor. You know, you have a bad apple harassing someone in a workplace, but most of discrimination is really systemic and structural. So in the case of a powerful bad actor, you have a whole system that works to protect that powerful person because they're concerned about liability to the organization. And that usually means turning against the person who came forward to raise the concern. But many things are more structural and systematic in terms of discrimination. We have, Nancy mentioned reliance on prior salary. That's an example of a policy that just perpetuates discrimination, excluding people because they have a prior arrest or conviction record. That's another example of a policy, as well as just systematically hiring people of one background because you believe they're more vulnerable and won't complain. We see that kind of systematic discrimination as well.
That's extremely interesting. And I guess, I think to your point that some of this is systematic, one of the more interesting issues you raised in the paper, I thought, was that artificial intelligence could actually contribute to this, which seems like the ultimate systematization of this. So I was wondering if you could just kind of talk a little bit about what you meant there.
Sure. So we see technology being increasingly used to help employers really cull the volume of applications that they're getting. With online, most jobs now you can apply online. So employers have been inundated with applications. Many of people may not have the basic qualifications that they're looking for. So many employers have been looking to technology as a solution. And I believe that technology can help if done carefully, right? But the concern that I have raised with some of these systems, some rely on artificial intelligence, they develop algorithms. And often what's happening is these systems are being built based on training data from your current workforce. And it's very easy to just replicate your current workforce, not only based on job-related characteristics, but all characteristics, right? There was attention in the media about this one recruiting system, and they found out the two greatest indicators of success were being made Jared and playing high school lacrosse, right? And that had nothing to do with the job, but they were replicating the characteristics of the current workforce. So if you have these systems, which often operate as somewhat of a black box because vendors develop them, they believe the information is proprietary, employers who use them often don't even know how they're really making decisions. And employers have that obligation to understand exactly who you're screening out in the process. So it's very important for employers to actually have that information. So if employers don't even often have the information, how are these systems being designed? Who are you screening out? Who are you including and why? There is really no way an individual worker would have enough information to understand how these systems work, right? You have new video-based hiring systems that are analyzing your micro expressions, your voice cadence, and making a judgment about whether you're a fit for the job. Many people don't even know they're being evaluated, right? A person with a disability may not present in the same way if someone is deaf, for example, and speaking into a video recording. And there isn't a way for people to actually know, oh, I'm being judged by an algorithm, and to ask for a reasonable accommodation or a range of other issues that it can present. So my interest in this area is to really make sure that we can use technology in a positive way, right? To reduce, we know there's a lot of subjectivity in many of our existing systems that operates to perpetuate bias in a systemic way. We've seen that from these match pair resume studies that show systemic racial bias. And we know we need to do something different, right? So the solution isn't, let's just go back to like subjective interviews and our gut feelings, but it's also not to say this is an objective system that we can rely on unchecked. We really need to build the kind of systems that provide safeguards for workers as they're applying with these new screens, because often they're being designed somewhat separate, from anti-discrimination principles and really understanding what a valid system and bias monitoring process needs to have.
Absolutely. And I guess, when obviously you've very clearly identified the issue here, but what can policymakers realistically do about what seems like just a huge divide in power between employers and employees when it comes to these information disparities?
Well, I think there's a lot we can do from a policy level. I mean, the biggest challenge is you have a massive resource disparity between an individual worker and an employer. And that's where the government has a really important role to play to balance that power disparity. Agencies like the EOC and OFCCP can come in and request the kind of data and information that's needed for an individual to prove their case. It's very difficult for an individual to find lawyers, to pay for their time, to develop that kind of case. So enforcement agencies need resources. Valerie ended her remarks saying you need consistent enforcement. The problem is we don't have consistent enforcement, right? Right now, if you did have a pay problem as an employer, the likelihood that anybody would learn of it, to have enough information to actually to pursue a claim, to actually be willing to take the risk and have the resources to pursue the claim are very, very slim. So many employers then take the position that they actually don't want to know there's a problem because then they would have to fix it, right? And that's the unfortunate incentives that some of our systems create. So we need to align our systems so that actually you have the incentive to understand where your problems exist. That's the structure that's set up for OFCCP. Federal contractors have an obligation to do an affirmative action program. They have an obligation to provide the agency with data on the demographics of their workforce, to do an annual pay equity audit. That information is vitally important to measure how you're doing as an organization and to have the oversight and the power of the purse, right? You have a client that really cares about equity. And I think that's something that can change more broadly, and to build that into not only our enforcement, but into the kind of data that's disclosed, right? To have more public information about the demographics of a workforce, I think creates greater accountability. At the EOC, I work to create a pay data collection because we recognize that as an agency, that was one of the hardest areas for us to learn of a problem, because we didn't have data to understand where the problems might exist. We had data on overall workforce representation demographics, and that really helped us identify hiring discrimination, because you could see for a particular employer in a particular region who were outliers, like who just didn't hire women at all, or hadn't promoted women, even though, or people of color, even though at one level below you have a very qualified workforce. So that data was incredibly helpful, and we wanted to have similar data to help us better identify where patterns of pay discrimination may exist. So I think that kind of data collection encourages employers to pay attention. And I think the main change that we need to make is we need greater accountability for employers, a greater likelihood that if you violate the law, you will be held accountable, because that will create the incentives for employers to focus proactively in designing systems to prevent discrimination, to monitor systems, to identify problems, to want to actually know and do their due diligence, to understand where their systems are leading to discrimination, because ultimately organizations have to be responsible for the systems that they design, they implement, and those results, right? It isn't only does a bad actor desire to harm people, but a much broader accountability for the systems that are in place and the ways in which they're operating to discriminate.
Great, interesting. This has been so interesting. I think we're going to open it up to the floor now, or Zoom screen, as it were. But just as a reminder to the audience, we are going to take audience questions pretty shortly here, so keep them coming. I've seen a whole bunch coming in, but if you have additional ones, please drop them in that Q&A chat. I was hoping for our floor discussion that I could get started with Jane, if you don't mind. You know, the papers we've talked about today all kind of discuss race and gender disparities and policies that might help to reduce those inequities. But there's obviously an intersection between those various kinds of discrimination and disparity. And I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about why that overlap matters, especially when we're, trying to design policy solutions for these problems.
Sure. I mean, I think it's been pretty, obvious through a lot of the data coming during the pandemic that, women of color have been disproportionately impacted by what's going on. And a lot of that has to do with what has already been talked about, women of color being disproportionately making up the low wage workforce and often having fewer workplace supports in their workplaces. So, I mean, I think I'm going to focus specifically on women of color, mainly because I did a lot of work around the discrimination that women of color face in the workplace in my last job. Women of color face both gender discrimination, race discrimination, and also discrimination at the intersections. And all of those things in many ways amplify both the information and power asymmetries that we're talking about here in terms of employment discrimination enforcement. When we think about the information asymmetries, it's already difficult enough to get the information, but then we're talking about the fact that we need both race and gender information. And sometimes, we might get the race information or the gender information, but we won't get the information broken down for, Black women, AAPI women, Latinas, and that makes it much more difficult to prove that those populations are being discriminated against. But the other thing I also wanted to focus on was, the fact that women of color make up a disproportionate number of the low wage workforce means that they face the brunt of the power disparities when it comes to employment discrimination enforcement. We talk about in our paper about Title VII gaps in coverage and that disproportionately impacting home care workers who are disproportionately women of color and immigrant women. And so the fact that they make up a disproportionate number of the low wage workforce means that they have no coverage, no protections under our anti-discrimination laws. But even if they are protected by our anti-discrimination laws, women of color who make up the low wage workforce also when they face retaliation, it's that much more difficult, to want to come forward with discrimination, mainly because the economic costs are too high. And then on top of that, the resource imbalance for those in the low wage workforce of hiring an attorney, maybe their workforce doesn't have an HR department. If their workforce doesn't have an HR department, then there's really no one to complain to, and the only option is to bring a lawsuit on their own, and that's just yet another barrier that they have to face. And then the other things are just things that impact women who are at the intersection of identities. For instance, in my last job, I worked a lot with Asian American and Pacific Islander women, and there were issues with not wanting to come forward because of immigration status, because of language barriers, and those are just other barriers that prevent women from being able to come forward. On top of the fact that, in a lot of ways, and this is sort of beyond the scope of my paper, our case law hasn't really reckoned with intersectional discrimination and how women of color are disproportionately are uniquely impacted by discrimination through stereotypes that particularly are associated with different groups of women of color. So there are a lot of barriers that women of color face, and I think the solutions really need to sort of grapple with that reality that women of color face intersectional discrimination, but also that they can often be disproportionately impacted by making up a disproportionate number of impacted communities. And we really need to think, when we think about policy solutions, we need to think about that with that in mind. And some of the solutions that I think of when in sort of decreasing the power imbalances are with respect to race and gender discrimination, particularly at the intersection, is how do we increase enforcement for those communities? And some of the things that I was thinking about in my last job in outreaching to immigrant Asian American women was, doing more outreach, for the EEOC to do more outreach to immigrant communities so that more people will come forward and that they can do more representation of those communities in complaints and in lawsuits, so that they're not bearing the brunt of the resource disparities and things like that, because they can have legal representation through the EEOC. So things like that can really target impacted communities, and I think that's those are some of the things that we need to think about when we design policy solutions, rather than kind of thinking of everyone as sort of a monolith, but really thinking uniquely about how to reach different communities.
That is such an interesting point. Nancy, I wonder if you could actually weigh in on that a little bit, because obviously I think many of the issues that Jane just highlighted are things that your research speaks to as well. And I guess, when we're talking about sort of the caregiving community, for example, how does it, how do sort of the design elements of how we think about increasing employee power matter?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say what I would really like to achieve is some kind of synthesis between stratification economics and intersectionality. I think that what I really like about stratification economics is the focus on collective interests and collective kind of contest, almost framed as a kind of analog to class conflict. And what I like about intersectionality is the complexity of the ways in which different group memberships overlap in ways that can compound advantage or can compound disadvantage in really significant ways. But to me, the really crucial issue is that a lot of people are in contradictory positions. They're winners in some respects and they're losers in other respects. And so the challenge really for effective collective action is how do you build alliances and coalitions between people between groups that have historically been at odds, but who and who might experience some short-term costs from cooperation, but stand to benefit enormously in the long run. This is what I think is powerful about the CARE frame, is it's saying, look, we really have a common interest in developing human capabilities and developing a society that's oriented towards less towards the production of things and more towards the production of ourselves and a good lives and a good social climate. And I think actually that is a place where gender could actually be a unifying force, because a lot of women are doing care work, either unpaid or paid work. And that commonality, I'd like to think that that commonality could be a kind of force for helping build an even broader coalition.
Valerie, you look like you have thoughts.
Yeah, I just, I agree with what Nancy and Jane have already raised in terms of the intersectional nature. And I do think that it's important to think about how stratification economics intersects with intersectional analysis, and sort of how the dynamics of multiple aspects of identity factor into this. I think there are opportunities in terms of solidarity around some of the gender disparities. We know that the racial gaps between women are smaller than they are among men, but when we compare pay of women, Black or white, relative to white men in particular, those gaps are huge. So there already we see that the racial gap may, among women at least, may not look like it's huge. I think even as far back in the 80s, there was actually a slight advantage in pay for Black women relative to white women that we've never seen among men. But again, when we broaden that analysis and bring gender along with race, we see that there are those huge disparities of pay that are, again, connected to differences in power in the workforce and the way that structures and systems are designed to favor men over women. And also the isolation or segregation or concentration of women into a smaller number of occupations. I think that condenses some of that pay disparity by race among women as well.
Yeah, good point.
It's very interesting. You know what, if I'm actually going to change up our program a little bit here. We were planning on doing a few more minutes of this, but we actually have a ton of audience questions, and I'm afraid we're not going to get to them all. So if it's okay with all the panelists, I might actually jump to some of the audience questions right away. And then at the end, I'll ask everybody to sort of sum up with a takeaway. But just to get us started on the audience questions, one thing that it seems like people are consistently curious about is whether the relative value of employers and workers ends up varying over the business cycle, which I think is something we've touched on a little bit, but maybe Valerie, if you could start us off on that. It does seem like a very valid question.
Yeah, I think it does. And I think, again, it depends on whether or not we're in a position where we see tight labor markets, meaning that unemployment is really low. That tends to put upward pressure on wages for all groups of workers. And again, the lower that unemployment falls, we tend to see even more upward pressure on the wages of Black workers who started, at a lower level of pay to begin with. When we're in periods of recession, again, there are what I often will refer to as the cost of discrimination diminishes. And so when you have a huge pool of workers looking for jobs, it's easy to sort of pick and choose who you're going to hire, and it's easy to pay less for those employees. And so I think the business cycle definitely has an impact on these dynamics.
And then I guess one thing that is really interesting to me actually is the coronavirus business cycle is obviously such a very weird one. And one of the ways it seems like it might be weird is just that it appears to be exacerbating sort of these employee-employer information mismatches that we have all the time, just because employees aren't not even seeing their coworkers now, or there could be coworkers. Jenny or Jane, whoever wants to take it, I was wondering if one of you could kind of talk a little bit about what we are seeing when it comes to these information dynamics in the pandemic downturn.
Sure. I think the pandemic is raising many new risks for employers, both because workers are more vulnerable, right? As Valerie was talking about with the labor market, right? We're still down 9 million jobs since the beginning of the pandemic. And when workers are feeling job insecurity, they are not going to raise issues of discrimination, right? And we know that what we learned after Me Too was that 99.8% of people who experience harassment, some researchers has estimated, will never come forward to raise a complaint. And that was even before COVID made workers much more vulnerable. There's research that shows Black workers are retaliated against at a much higher rate than white workers for raising health and safety concerns because of COVID, right? So we also need to be mindful of how employers are reacting when people are raising health and safety concerns and whether that's being implemented in a discriminatory way. We're also seeing a rise in hate incidents against Asian Americans across the country, right? COVID has led to a stereotyping, this sort of othering of the Asian American community that we also expect to see enter into the workplace as well, right? I've heard reports of people not being assigned to certain jobs because you think that customers will not want an Asian American person in that role. And that's the kind of more systemic stereotyping discrimination that we see throughout our policies that I think the vulnerabilities and uncertainties created by COVID could exacerbate. Jane, did you have anything to add to that?
I guess I wonder, when it comes to several people in the questions have sort of, I think, a similar question about whether unions can fix some of the problems you just detailed, when it comes to things like being nervous about reporting a problem, complaining about COVID work conditions. Do they fix those issues, especially on sort of racial and gender disparity lines, or do they provide this full sense of security? And it seems like several people have some variety of that question.
Yeah, I'd be happy to start and turn it over to others, but I think unions have an incredibly powerful role to play in helping to identify where there may be patterns of discrimination and supporting workers who come forward. One of the key recommendations we make in our report is that we need to engage all of the entities that have the power to have a voice and to raise the voice of individual workers, right? Unions, worker centers, other community organizations play a really important role in identifying the problem. They can file charges with federal agencies without putting the worker on notice. I mean, not without revealing the worker's identity and putting them at risk of retaliation. But I think there's a real opportunity for unions to do even more and to understand that simply organizing does not necessarily lead to equity, right? If you're still a minority within a larger organization, if you're still primarily in the lower ranks of an organization, right, there will be different issues. And I think the union has a powerful role to play in understanding how people experience work based on their backgrounds and perspectives, and to understand how to bring forward, right, and build allyship across different racial backgrounds, across gender identities, so that members can support each other and advocate for equality. Because ultimately, equality is not a zero-sum game, right? We need to understand each person's needs within a workplace to ensure it's inclusive. And I think the union has an incredibly powerful role to play in ensuring it isn't simply perpetuating the current workforce by relationships and otherwise in hiring. And then once you're in the workplace, it is able and willing to confront issues of discrimination, including things like sexual harassment. Because it's critical, right, to workers and all workers, and to having sort of the courage to lift up and build collective action to support others, I think is really valuable and important opportunity that unions have. Interesting.
And then I guess, relatedly, and I think a question that actually cuts across several of the themes we've been talking about, it does seem like in a moment like right now, like with all the COVID layoffs happening, there are real questions about how much we know about who's laid off, who is made redundant in any given moment. And so someone in the chat is asking how those data, that lack of data, that lack of transparency and the opaqueness of layoff processes can interact with some of the issues we're talking about today. So does anybody have an interest in starting that one off?
Well,
So go ahead.
go ahead.
So I think if we go back to the start of the pandemic, what we saw then, and this is just looking at sort of aggregate numbers, was really sort of outside of the norm, because there was really across the board sort of shutdown. And in that instance, we saw fairly uniform rise in unemployment at the beginning. Over time, as we have regained some of those jobs, Jenny mentioned that we're still about 9.5 million down. We've started to see the unequal patterns that are more consistent with what we've observed historically start to emerge again. So that the reduction, for example, in the Black unemployment rate hasn't improved to the extent that we have seen the white unemployment rate decline. In terms of the decisions being made in individual companies about who to bring back, when to bring them back, that's something that we don't have a lot of information on. All we have is the aggregate numbers. But I think it's interesting to consider different ways that we can measure and account for those differences. One would be through some uniform sort of reporting, like was proposed, or like the EEOC does for hiring and promotions, and like was proposed and actually tried for several months in terms of pay. But I think there's also something to be gained by just listening to and understanding the anecdotal experiences of workers. For example, I know people who during the Great Recession were laid off, African Americans were laid off in companies where they were clearly a very small minority of the workforce. There are several rounds of layoffs. How is it that a group that represents maybe 1% of your workforce ends up in every round of those layoffs? So, there are things like that that we can learn about how, these decisions sort of play out. And we've all heard the adage of last hired and first fired, and what that means in terms of patterns of rising and falling unemployment rates that we see across the business cycle. I think Nancy had some things to add there as well.
Well, I just wanted to add that for women, the labor force participation rate is just as important as the unemployment rate. That what we see is a lot of women who've just dropped out of the labor force altogether because of just the impossibility of combining work and family. But I think there's another interesting effect of the pandemic, which is that it's been a big external shock to the organization of work. And I don't think we fully understand the consequences yet. But let me just say, for years, economists have argued that the reason women earn less than men is that they're not willing to work as many hours or to stay at the office long enough. And that has just been that argument has just been completely blown away by the enormous transformation in the organization of work, both temporal and spatial, that now we have a large segment of the workforce that's working at home and is also working very variable hours. That is, putting the kids to bed and going back to work, or getting up early in the morning and working and then feeding the kids breakfast and so forth and so on. And it really shows how, in some ways, the whole organization of work we relied on was kind of an inertial, and just that's the way we have always done it. We can't do it any differently. Now it's going to be done differently. So what are the consequences going to be for earnings inequality? I think they could be very negative, that workers with the capacity to work from home are going to continue to be in a pretty strong bargaining position, and other workers are going to be hammered. I'm very concerned that the impact of the pandemic is going to be increased just increased inequality between people who can work with a computer, and people who don't. And a lot of care workers are kind of caught in between.
That's a really interesting point. That's a really interesting point. I guess, one question that sort of builds on that a little bit is someone in the chat is actually wondering, if you get into a situation where you are dealing with a discriminatory practice, whether that be in hiring, whether that be, in the workplace, perhaps one of one of the various scenarios we've just talked about. What do you actually do about that? Like, if your boss is racist or a bully, what can you do to resolve that? And I'm not sure who the right person is to answer that. Maybe Jenny?
Sure. Well, I think that raises some of the challenges, right? As an individual coming forward, I think one of the things we recommend is that you have sort of multiple channels of resolving concerns within an organization. Most organizations do have a formal complaint process, right? Where you can't necessarily protect somebody's identity. The person who engaged in the objectionable behavior will likely know it's you that's raising it. One of the things we recommended coming out of our task force looking at harassment prevention at the EOC was that you need multiple channels of raising concerns. So ombuds offices are one way to do that protect actually individuals, right? So if someone is in a dynamic where they don't feel comfortable raising that to their supervisor, right? Because anyone watched long enough, you can find something they're doing wrong, right? Any single, it's like when a police car is behind you and you get all nervous and roll through a stop sign. So there is a lot of risk, right? Everyone has risk in raising these concerns. But if you have a structure that empowers people to actually act on the concern, that wants to know about the concern, right? If there are people to go to, like an ombuds office, that can then say to someone on a confidential basis, think about how to raise the issue, right? How to do a targeted training for certain managers on leadership or to raise concerns. I think many managers would want to know these things before it becomes an actionable complaint, right? To nip a problem in the bud, to understand if their style may be actually making people feel uncomfortable, right? So I think that organizations need to think about that from a systems approach, right? Don't just expect, if you've never heard of a problem because nobody's raised a complaint, that you don't have one, right? I heard a lot of organizations say that after the Me Too movement exposed the scope of the problem, right? They thought we were behind these issues. And the reason we launched this task force at EOC is we were seeing systemic harassment in all its forms, not just sexual harassment, egregious, racial, national origin, disability-based harassment. And employers were surprised that this was happening, right? And the issue wasn't that people didn't know it was discrimination. It was that there was no accountability. So people weren't comfortable raising it and coming forward, and there weren't sufficient channels to go to. So I think organizationally, there needs to be a process, not just to surface complaints, but also to proactively do climate surveys, do focus groups where people can sort of come together, right? Where you have a diversity task force, right? People can confidentially raise an issue. This structure that's empowered to take action can then help make recommendations for the organization. And that helps to be proactive in learning where your problems are.
Great, interesting. And I guess actually relatedly, Jenny, there's a question specifically for you, which is, what are the prospects for changing public policy to affirmatively reward bidders on federal contracts who have a record of workplace equal treatment, non-discrimination, or that meet certain pay equity or job integration goals?
That's an important opportunity because really much of our anti-discrimination law focuses on proving discrimination after the fact, right? And what we do in our paper is talk about why all of these hurdles make it very likely that we will actually address the overwhelming majority of discrimination that happens, right? Because of all those hurdles. If you can really build a better process at the front end, where the federal government and others, right, who hire contractors or others, really make a cornerstone of who you hire, right? An entity that is really advancing equal opportunity, right? And that can be demonstrated by having that kind of representation within your organization and having policies that are not just on paper, right? But that are actually lived through the values and the experience of people in the organization. So I think that is where one of the greatest opportunities exists for the federal government and other, right? Many large corporations also hire, contractors for work, and there's that opportunity to make equal employment opportunity, diversity, equity, inclusion, sort of a centerpiece of how you select the people that you want to work with.
Great, great, interesting. And then Valerie, we actually had a question specifically for you as well, which is, could you speak a little bit further on race being a social construct designed for the purpose of creating lesser racial strata and effectively not intended to serve affirmative purpose?
So again, the whole concept of race, we can go back and look to the founding of this country, the first time that Africans landed on the shores of this country in 1619, and really sort of what evolved from there. There was a clear distinction to be made between people who had origins on the continent of Africa and those who came to this country from Europe. And that distinction specifically was important on the basis of skin color, because that is one of the most easily observable characteristics. That's an easy way to distinguish folks based on just the surface physical characteristic. And in wanting to, in particular, capitalize and exploit free labor, there needed to be a way to identify who would provide free labor. This is what their position is, then skin color. So I think, we can go back to look at how race functioned through the institution of slavery. Now, of course, before slavery, servants who were also from European countries who came over, perhaps later came over, in debt, etc., and had an opportunity to work for a period of time or that and be free citizens. Race was used to find a permanent underclass of people. And with that being such a central institution, the foundation of this country that was instrumental in generating wealth in this country nationally, as well as for certain individuals, perpetuated over time. So when I say it's a social construct to sort of assign privilege, that's what I mean by that. That designation was used to say, these are the people who are going to be permanently underclass, permanently without any agency of their own. We are free to exploit them, and even to the extent that we won't even consider these human beings. I think it, deep as a social construct and a way of assigning privilege. But I also think that it's important when we think about our analysis and economic analysis, when we're talking about disparity, that we of that is not just a disadvantage or penalty on the part of Black workers, other communities, but it also represents an advantage on the part of white workers. And I think it's important that we have that conversation and use that kind of language to understand that it operates on both sides. It's not just that these people are disadvantaged or unskilled or unprepared. It's that there's been an unfair, unjustified, often advantage placed upon whiteness relative to Blackness.
I wonder if you could unpack that a little bit, in the sense that why is it so important to emphasize the advantage piece as well?
Because I think that influences the kinds of solutions that we develop. If the answer is only that there's a disadvantage here, these people are inadequate in some way, are lacking something, the focus is totally on fixing that group of people, as opposed to thinking about the broader structural implications of those inequities and disparities, and thinking about the bigger picture. Is there unfair advantage that needs to be addressed, as opposed to what are these people missing? What do we need to do to sort of fix the disadvantage or the penalty on that end?
Right. That's interesting. Nancy, I think we have a question for you that I'm curious to hear the answer to, which is, is there anything that can be done to or that can happen to improve the number of meaningful part-time jobs which caregivers may be more likely to need? So I guess the person seems to be asking, is there something that we can do to sort of meet the structural needs of this workforce that may be different, rather than trying just to sort of fit them into the needs of the non-caregiving workforce?
I think that's a great question. And yes, I think there are regulatory tools that we could use to make part-time work better quality work. And those include things like making sure that part-time workers have prorated benefits and are not, eliminating the kind of hours divide that allows employers to just not offer benefits, segment their workforce by offering benefits to full-time but not part-time workers. I think there's also an issue about scheduling. A lot of part-time workers are subject to really arbitrary scheduling decisions that are very disruptive of work-family benefits. And there's a lot of interesting research on just how costly and stressful that is. And so like just-in-time inventory of workers. And that's also something that we could get at on the regulatory level. And I also think the social policies I was mentioning before, if people are relevant, if people had a little bit of a cushion in terms of a fallback position, and this is why I think support for a universal basic income is growing everywhere around the world, is that it's not so much that it would necessarily give people enough money to, completely drop out of the system, but it gives them a fallback position and it enables them to pick and choose a little bit better, more effectively, what kinds of jobs they might want to take. And it also makes part-time work more feasible, because it means that part-time work becomes an easier way of paying the bills. So I think changing the temporal organization of work is going to be really a big thing on the agenda in the years to come.
That's an interesting point. And then actually very relatedly, so Nancy, I might stay with you for the moment, and then but I have a feeling everybody will have thoughts on this. Somebody's asking if you could speak a little bit more about work that has traditionally been done by women and how the pay gap changes when more men move into that profession.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a little complicated. I mean, in general, when men move into care work jobs, they tend to earn more than the women in those jobs. But that's partly related to what I was emphasizing earlier, the history. They have a higher fallback position. If there's a selection bias, that is, the men that are not getting higher wages are not entering the care sector because they can get higher wages elsewhere. So I think that's part of it. And I think it's really important to recognize that research on care penalties shows that men as well as women in a job are earning less in a care job than a non-care job, controlling for their education and experience. So it's kind of a mixed bag. On the one hand, they often move into care jobs and earn higher wages, but on the other hand, on average, men in care work are earning less, and that, that's something that we need to change.
That's an interesting point.
I would just add, I do think there is a real role of bias and stereotyping in that process. There's interesting research showing before Title IX, the coaches for women's sports teams at the college level were all women. And then after Title IX, colleges had to pay more for these coaches. They had to have the teams. And then you saw like mostly men taking these roles, right? And it wasn't that women became less qualified to coach women's sports, but it was this perception, right? I mean, I don't know all the research on it, but I think there is a perception that men, that they bring to the men somehow are more qualified, right? Which is not actually true. So I think often you bring these stereotypes and you recognize that you need to match, to your point, Nancy, other alternatives that people have, and it changes how people value the work, I think.
Yeah, I think all those things really work together. You're absolutely right.
Sort of, before we wrap up here, I was wondering if maybe every panelist would just go ahead and wrap up with one takeaway thought that you think that the viewers today should be conscious of, or do you think sort of sums up the message of your paper in this discussion? Nancy, do you want to go ahead and kick us off?
Instead of summing up, I'm just going to throw out one thing that I didn't get a chance to talk about that I think is really important, which is I think it's really interesting to see there's a lot of discussion now about below replacement fertility. And especially during the pandemic, the birth rate really fell. And there is a sense in which the declining birth rate really makes us see that raising kids is really costly, expensive, difficult work. And some people are not going to agree to do it unless you can make the conditions of being a parent in a modern day society better. So I think there's kind of some bargaining over the distribution of the costs of social reproduction here that's overlaying the employer-employee bargaining in a way. And I think that kind of fits with our general perspective on the many layered and complex nature of collective bargaining.
That's an interesting point. Jenny, I see you're unmuted, so do you want to go next?
Sure. I want to leave with this thought that I am optimistic that we can achieve real and potentially transformational change now. And the reason that I'm optimistic is that we have more people of all backgrounds understanding that we have a problem and that the systems that we have in place are a part of that problem, right? So the first step to addressing a problem is acknowledging that it exists. So we have more people that understand that. We have a president who has made a historic commitment to advancing racial equity and all forms of equity as a core pillar of his administration. And that message is coming loud and clear throughout the administration. These issues are a top priority. And we have employers making powerful statements and commitments to it and putting the resources behind advancing racial equity. And it will take all of us in a way that we've never seen before to be able to do something bold, to be able to come together and understand the role each of us can be playing as part of this movement. It is both about cultural change in workplaces. It's about systems and process change. It's about committing to put the resources to have consistent enforcement. And I think we have that. And then also with technology, it empowers workers to organize themselves, to speak out on social media, and more reporters like yourself are covering these issues than ever before. Issues of equity were never front and center in the way that they are now. So that makes me optimistic that we're going to see real and hopefully lasting change in advancing equity in the years ahead.
Valerie?
Yeah, I will co-sign on what both of the previous speakers just said. But I also want to say that I think that, our conversation today, the research that we've all done has made it really clear that this idea of a perfectly competitive labor market is a myth. We know that employers are rarely so powerless as to have no ability to pay workers less than their level of productivity, or even pay workers differently who have similar backgrounds and skills. But in recognizing that, what is necessary is that we have interventions to address that inequality. And in order to develop the right kinds of interventions and solutions, we really need to broaden the frameworks that we use to understand how power, race, gender, the law, all of these things intersect to create these outcomes, and the changes that can be made and should be made to create a more fair and equitable workforce for everyone.
And Jane, if you want to finish us off here.
Sure. Just very briefly, I think I would just want people to walk away with the idea that, workers face such information and power disparities, and right now our enforcement system places so much of the burden and responsibility of enforcing our anti-discrimination laws on them. And really, we need to rebalance and have employers and the government take on a much larger responsibility. And I want people to just remember that Title VII, the purpose was to prevent discrimination. It's not And right now we have a system where, workers have to come forward and after the fact built to prevent discrimination. And so we really need to think of policies that really go towards that end goal. And that's it.
And I think we are done here. So, but I'll turn it back over to Taya to wrap it up.
Thank you so much, Gina. Thank you, Jenny, Jane, Nancy, and Valerie. That was a tremendous set of presentations. It was thoughtful, it was substantive, it was really engaging. So thanks so much to all of you, and thank you to the audience for joining us this afternoon. We really appreciate you being with us, and we really appreciate the really great questions that you all shared with us. We didn't have time to get to all of them, but we will do our best to stay engaged with all of you. I encourage all of you to go to EPI's website, epi.org. Sign up for our newsletter or notices of future events if you haven't already done so. We would love to stay in touch with you and to keep you abreast of all the great research and policy analysis that EPI is doing. So once again, join me in thanking our amazing speakers for today's event, and we look forward to seeing you in a future date. Thanks so much.